Hello, good afternoon everyone. My name is Lucy Calipari-Marcuzzo. I'm the Gallery and Heritage Team Leader here at Mildura Arts Centre. Mildura Arts Centre acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land which now comprise the Mildura Rural City Municipality. We pay our respects to elders past and present and celebrate and respect their continuing culture and acknowledge the memories of their ancestors. On behalf of Mildura Arts Centre, welcome to today's event, 2D or Not 2D Curators Talk with Marg and Stephen Naylor. This lecture is a complimentary public program for our newly opened Mildura Arts Centre 70th Anniversary exhibition, 2D or Not 2D. We are, at MAC, we are delighted to have worked with Marg and Stephen for a number of months on the show and celebrating the opening weekend together, which has been awesome. I would also like to acknowledge Deputy Mayor Councillor Helen Healy and Councillor Jodie Ewings and members of the Mildura Arts and Culture Advisory Committee for joining us today. It is now my pleasure, big pleasure, I was going to say something else but I didn't write it down, to introduce Professor Stephen Naylor to the lectern and a note that we will be taking questions at the end of the talk. So if you do have any questions during the course of the lecture, just hold on to them, try and remember them, and then you'll have an opportunity to do that at the end. So welcome, Stephen. So Stephen will take the mic.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks to all of you for coming along on a Sunday afternoon. It's always a pleasure to talk about art, and it's even better if there's a bit of an audience who will kind of respond to some of the things that we're saying. Look, I guess we also have to pay our respects to the original custodians on the land in which we gather and acknowledge that the Aboriginal people were, of course, the first artists and creatives to represent this land, its features, its spirits and its gifts. And as I said yesterday, this exhibition would be empty without the participation and the representation of Indigenous voices. Look, it's a while since I've actually given a lecture, and I guess I'm looking at a couple of students, I won't say old students, but certainly students who would have endured me gas-bagging on about the arts many years ago. It's something that I probably haven't done in terms of my professional life for the last few years, but it's always been very close to my heart in that when Marg and I travel, it's always trying to provide an opportunity to share things that we've seen that we think are valuable. And I guess being invited to come back to Mildura to curate the 70th anniversary was an opportunity to get back on that bike, I suppose, that we started riding a long time ago, and maybe share a few of the things that we learnt along the way. But I think it's also going to hopefully set up some conversations that might perhaps take us on for the next 30 years, because I guess the 70th year is really just a prelude to the centenary. Marg and I arrived here in 1983, and for those of you who remember 1983, it was a drought year. It was the years of Ash Wednesday. It was the big dust when Melbourne learnt about what happens when you endure drought in the Wimmera Mallee and the Sunraysia and north. And of course, it had a huge impact on a whole lot of things. I came here as an art craft teacher out at Redcliffs High School, which I was very thankful. I grew up in Warwick, Nabil, so we would always holiday in Mildura over the course of years, and I probably started doing that in the 60s. So it was a familiar place to come to. Marg, though, came as an artist in residence, and Maydeck was one of the chief advocates for the arts in those days, and Peter Greed, who was the director of Maydec at the time, negotiated with Michel Saunier, the director here, and Marge stayed in the cottage out the back. The rest's probably history. We both were involved in teaching. Marge, I guess, probably looked more in a regional area. And when you think about 1983, we were just talking the other day, that it wasn't so much about bringing the arts to people, but rather than bringing people out of the very dire situation that a lot of farming communities were in at that particular time. And it was an opportunity, I think, to have conversations, to open up possibilities, to get your head out of perhaps some of the challenges that were there. And over a period of time, I think, not saying that art's therapy, but art can be a catalyst that can engage at many different levels. And I think that purposefulness nature of art is something that we all should embrace. So when we were asked to do the 70th anniversary, the first thing that you think back to is, what did they do for the 50th? And I think that was Marge's last gig here before she came up to North Queensland. And it was collection 50, and it was 50 works, 50 essays, to represent, you know, some of the high points of the collection. And of course, the Mildura Arts Centre has a very rich collection, although I think when we look at it, it's patchy. It is very, very well represented in certain areas, and I think some of the gaps are quite significant and were only able to be plugged largely by the video installation that Rob put together, where we were able to use a lot of the documentation of events and artworks which were much more ephemeral, performative, to actually fill that whole story up. But yes, it would have been easy for us to do 70 works, 70 essays and follow that, that model, but there are just so many possibilities, so we kind of strayed from the safe and moved into something that was perhaps a little bit more provocative. What we wanted was to have a conversation. 70 years is a lot of time for a community to invest in cultural assets, in stories, in objects, and ultimately it tells us about who we are. Again, I mentioned yesterday, and I always used to talk to students about this, it's very rare for a period of history to be dominated by the economy. When people look back in time, it's usually the culture that is the first point of reference, and then you contextualise with economy and politics and all of those other areas. So let's use this as a great opportunity to look back and hopefully anticipate what might be coming. So there's the reflective, looking at the influences, and of course there were so many themes that we could pick up on. When we started, we thought, oh, we can have this corner, you know, about sustainability, and this one can be about the environment, and here we can have Indigenous voices, and, you know, I mean, that becomes a kind of a safe passage. It reads very much like chapters in a book. I think we wanted to try and do something a little different. So, in a conversation with Ross Lake and Helen Vivian, we were talking about a couple of key works, and we were reminded of Ken and Julia Yonatani's Salt Table and Banquet from one of the palimpsests. I can't remember which one, I think I'd gone at that stage, but it was an important work, and Helen said, oh, we've purchased this work and it's going to be coming out to Australia. And it's a 10-metre salt table with fruit and abundance from horticulture. And it would have been the piece that we would have run down the centre of Gallery 1 and 2. Now, all sorts of things happened. You know, there's a little war in the Middle East, and there's a little bit of transportation problems, and there's all sorts of logistics that perhaps got in our way. But the idea of having a conversation across a long table, to me, seemed like the logical place that we should start our 70th year anniversary. And in the absence of having the Yonatani piece, we thought, what have we got in the collection that is long, inviting, kind of unending? It doesn't have a beginning and an end. And it was, of course, John Davis's unrolled piece from 1970. And of course, this was important because John Davis was a teacher at Mildura High School when Tom was teaching there. And in fact, Jeff Brown mentioned yesterday that he and John Davis were actually at uni together at RMIT back in the 60s. So we've kind of got these connections in there. And obviously when you walk into the gallery space, the table is there. It sets to divide, but also to embrace a conversation. The other thing, as I said, it might have been possible to have clustered work together around themes, but we decided we'd go for the 70 years and look at the 7 decades. And of course, 7 has great resonance within the arts, but it also has a lot of resonances in many other aspects of life, and, you know, the chakras and all sorts of things. So let's embrace the fact that we have decades. And in the video piece, Rob has included each of the decades in there, and that's clustered some of the documentation works together in that place. And once you actually look at them, I think you get a sense that we have ebbs and flows over the 70 years. It's not been consistent, and that has been driven by all sorts of external forces, be it political, financial, you know, whether it's the directors who were here at particular times. There have been different people from community who have come in and augmented what's happened within the district, and then they've moved on. And of course, you go through these ebbs and flows. And to a certain extent, that's sort of like the seasons. You know, we expect there to be cycles to come through. But what they do is they do give us a context. So I guess we start at the beginning, and that is at the this end of the long table, and it starts with the Elliott collection. Now, of course, the Elliott collection is very much about the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it is a fairly conservative perspective. Senator Elliott was in awe of the concept of the British sort of imperialist role that they held, and the power of Britain at that particular time was something that he certainly reflected on. Now, I'm not saying monoculture, but it's a reference to a time that people think back to a certain extent. The work was largely about realism with hints of impressionism here or there, a little splash of the liberation of paint and a little bit of experimentation. But it certainly was not what we would refer to as modern art. And it certainly lacked a context of Mildura in 1950s. Now, the collection was bequeathed after, I think, 1944 with a conversation between Senator Elliott and Mildura. And to a certain extent, it was a defiant act because it is a very, very important collection outside of the UK, and the Orpans and the Brangwoods, and of course having a Degas were significant. But really what it was doing is it was reinforcing a particular time and a particular status that Senator Elliott believed very strongly in. Hilda, quite different. I guess, not fascination, but certainly the sensibilities of looking at Australian art, early 20th century and late 19th century Australian art was really important. And some of those pieces, certainly the Frederick McCubbin that we have in there, there's some beautiful Sydney Longs and some of the Elliot Gruners, and some of those are great works. Again, fairly conservative, but they certainly do create a platform on which a collection can be built. But if we look at it, and I sort of look back to the catalogues and stuff, it's important men and pretty women. That's largely what it's about. So we've kind of bookend one end of the gallery with that. The other one, though, and I think this is the defiant act, and I just loved that point where I got Betty as she is narrating the Degas. She, of course, was somebody passionate about the arts, incredibly well read, you know, became the gallery director of the National Gallery of Australia, you know, went to parties with Jackson Pollock in the 50s, knew so much, and the kind of visual tour that she took us on through this ABC series has been captured in the gallery, and it's worth listening to Betty as she talks about the formalistic qualities of Degas' work, the experimentation, but she also brings context to it, you know, talking about the back of the work, about how you look at the prodigies and the Providence. And I guess this is the formal component that's really important when we look at our collection, that we have to look beyond the surface. In terms of trying to present something to a community about itself, we also decided that the directors were catalysts in how the collection became what it is today, and how they occupied the role of almost the winemaker of the collection, so to speak. We've got 9 directors, managers, as we refer to them, over their period. And I was able to speak to Tom, to Michelle, to Michael, to Ian, to Julian, and to Antoinette. And unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of Eric. I tried as much as I possibly could. And of course, both Rex and Ernst have passed. But in Rio Vista, there is a dedicated section of signage which explores a little bit about the directors, so we know a little bit more about them. And the 3 questions that I asked them is, why did they want to take on the role of director of MAC? What they thought was their most, or what was the most significant achievement during their directorship. And the final one was what they would have liked to have changed if they'd had the opportunity to do that. That's all been absorbed into a little catalogue essay that you can take away. But it does give some pretty important insights into the formation of the collection and the sorts of events that took place. And the 50th anniversary was when that shot was taken of 6 of the directors who were able to come back together and to talk about Mildura and how important it was to them during their reigns as directors. There is, of course, much in the archives, and even though there's shoddy little images of Rex, it really opened up how this whole thing started. The bequest of the Elliott collection came with a proviso that a dedicated venue would be established for the collection to be housed. This, of course, was in defiance of, giving it to the NGV or one of the other regional areas. And I was saying to Helen yesterday, I think a lot of this has to do with Mildura's proximity. It's 550 k's from Melbourne, it's 400 from Adelaide, and 800 or 900 from Sydney. It is a kind of a neutral place. I think I say in the essay, Think Switzerland. And what you can actually do without having somebody breathing down your neck and overseeing is a strength. And I think Mildura has actually taken up that strength in terms of its food culture and in terms of some of the other great initiatives that it's engaged in over that particular time. But the collection was here. There was the plan to build a purpose-built space. However, Rio Vista was available, and it was decided to repurpose the Chaffey home to show the work. And of course, we always see those beautiful images of the Orpans and the Brangwens in many of the grand rooms of Rio Vista. It was Rex's job. Rex, of course, was a 32-year-old who had come from the Air Force after the Second World War, but was an art-trained individual who took up the opportunity to be the first director and to organise the collection so that it could be shown in Mildura. Of course, there was always challenges. There was never enough money. The spaces weren't perfect. But Rex went out of his way with incredible diligence and enthusiasm to make this place, I guess, the fertile ground to build something even better over that period of time. He engaged with artists and directors and curators from across Australia. Certainly Westbrook from the NGV was a really important contributor. The South Australian Gallery was also a contributor. And because Rex was an artist in his own right and was of good standing, he was able to engage with other artists. So Dargy, for instance, came through and ran workshops in the old mural hall, where it was very competitive to have actually got a place to work with Dargy. Now, Dargy, of course, as I said, was very important. He was on the Commonwealth National Advisory Board under Robert Menzies. Of course, I see Dargy and Robert Menzies perhaps in a different light. With my research from the Venice Biennale, I find that they actually stultified Australia's growth and ability to engage in the international sphere. And in fact, Dargy, when he went to the 1958 Venice Biennale, was shocked in the fact that they had a tapies in the next room and a burri. And he wrote back to Menzies and the Commonwealth Advisory Committee that some of the rubbish they had on the wall next to the streetons that we put up in 1958 and the landscapes by Arthur Boyd were far superior. However, he did mention that one of the attendants said that if you like the work in the Australian Pavilion in Venice, you might also like the Polish work as well. So, Dargy had an interesting perspective on what modern art should be and didn't want a bar of it. It was a community venue, and at the time, of course, it was a honeypot for the Gallery Society, for the Ballet Society, for the Film Society. It was the place where people from Mildura congregated to explore the cultural opportunities that were available in through their own means, I suppose. When Rex decided that he really needed to be an artist more than he needed to be a director, he went back to Melbourne. And that, of course, gave us the opportunity to get a new director. The Rio Vista was showing work. The mural hall had work in it. So the early gallery was functional, but perhaps it lacked a new direction. And this is where Ernst van Hattem, coming out from Holland, was able to bring an international perspective and certainly to look for the opportunities to bring a more contemporary view of the arts to Mildura. He clearly saw that there were gaps in the collection and was able to work very closely with Westbrook from the NGV, who'd suggested that it might be a good idea for Mildura to maybe take on sculpture as a medium to perhaps present something quite unique in an Australian sense. The first Mildura Sculpture Prize gave us the opportunity for sculptors who were somewhat neglected, I guess, in the Australian scene, to bring work to an outpost. You know, it was a frontier, so to speak, and certainly the first modern works that came through here did challenge some of the audience, but they also engaged. And if you think about modern sculpture, often steel, big, fairly machismo-based works, it was the right place to bring something like this to an audience. But I think also the fact that people of the land appreciated technique of welding, of manipulating steel in those areas. So maybe the aesthetic wasn't fully understood, but certainly the craft and the production sides were crucial. And I think that created that gap and made it a little bit narrower over those first few years in the 1960s. The other thing, though, was that education in the arts became important. And as I said before, John Davis, teaching at Mildura High, and Tom McCulloch were important people. Daniela Vasiliev, of course, was working here in Mildura after having operated in Melbourne previously. But to take up teaching roles was important for a livelihood, but also an opportunity to nourish students who were young and looking for opportunities to see the world through different eyes. Van Hattem, of course, went back to Europe, gathering ideas, bringing new knowledge, and when he saw the need to expand beyond Rio Vista and the mural hall into something more significant, like an arts centre, the funding and the political support actually was there, and the early seeds were sown through Ernst's work at that particular time. However, I think Ernst became a little over-ambitious in his planning and decided that he would be the best person to design the new building. And the Gallery Society chair, Kay Gambetta, at the time, apparently said this is something that should happen. However, council was much more of the opinion that you engage an architect who had worked with those types of cultural complexes and to try and build that up. So Ernst decided that his presence was no longer necessary, so he moved on. But before he did that, he had engaged the services of the young art teacher, Tom McCulloch. And Tom, of course, would spend weekends and after school helping Ernst prepare for the Sculpture Prize. This, of course, was the perfect segue when Ernst departed to be tapped on the shoulder to come and become the acting director, which he did for about 4 or 5 months, working his day job, teaching art in the secondary school and coming in at night and weekends to ensure that the gallery kept ticking over. He, I guess, was one of those people who was able to work with community, work with all players to really develop something quite unique. Jack Lynn, who ends up really creating the foundations for the National Gallery of Australia, talked about how innovative some of Tom's trainees were, and talked about the fact that the sculpture was something that really should be taken further than even paintings at that particular time. And I must admit, Marg and I are just so pleased that when you can pull out a Firth Smith, an Inga King, some of these works, Clement Meadmore, pop them on the wall and then get a kind of vignette of a shot like that. It's pretty special, and Mildura should feel pretty special about those kind of little clusters in the collection. Also beautifully lit and beautifully presented by the gallery staff and the installation team. Again, there would not have been too many regional galleries in Australia who could boast having a Christo, now Stefan, I've got to say it correctly, Baldessin, George Baldessin. And, because we were feeling a bit like we needed to bookend things, there's a Gainsborough and a Drysdale at each end. These things, and of course the Alex Danko, these sorts of little vignettes that you get to see in a show like this are special moments. These works sit to the right-hand side of the long table. They are the works from those outside the region. They bring inspiration and insights to Mildura and Sunraysia. Of course, Tom continued to grow, and through travelling overseas and being heavily engaged with contemporary art, launched Sculpturescape in '73. This work really put Mildura on the map internationally. I remember the first time I went to Documenta in Cassel in 1992, and I was looking through the archive and somebody said, can I help you? And I said, I'm from Mildura and I'm looking at sculpture. And they go, Mildura, wonderful to have somebody from Mildura. Because Mildura and Documenta in terms of sculpture were seen as kind of some of the leading places in the world. Tom actually charted the shift in practice from the strong machismo of those big, bold steel sculptures into something much more organic, something much more engaged in the environment, something much more responsive to contemporary art practice. It is, of course, of the time, the Whitlam era, the Australia Council, art schools are starting to flourish. We're seeing a whole change in the sensibilities of the Australian art world, largely off the hinge of sculpture. So these pieces really belong to the community and we need to be celebrating them. I mentioned the expanded field. Susan Sontag, the great theorist in the arts, was really talking about what was happening in Mildura, when she was referring to the earth art of that particular period, which was happening throughout the world. This engagement with outdoor spaces and site-specific work and installations was grist to the mill in the time. But, of course, Tom continued to grow, and some would say crossed a line, some would say kept expanding the field. And I think that at different times, and this is where I talk about the fluctuations, he came up against a council that was in a more conservative mode than previously. And of course, the the burning of the post-exhibition catalogue became that catalyst that saw the departure of Tom McCulloch, after 13 or 14 years. But when I spoke to Tom, he's 90, he is so lucid. He just said, Stephen, he said, it was my time. He said, I probably stayed too long. He said, I was offered jobs in other places, which I probably should have taken, but he said, my best years were in Mildura, and I feel so proud of those last 4 triennials. They mean everything to me. So, I don't think we ever lost Tom, and I know he keeps coming back, and there is a very warm place, I think, for Tom McCulloch and the legacy that he has presented. But he brought so many brilliant artists. Peter Tyndall's work, Jill Orr's work. The who's who were there all the time. Kevin Mortison in the 75 triennial. So much of that. They were all mainly sculpture teachers in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide. And of course, they also brought their motley crew of students, just like I used to take the motley crew of students to, the Adelaide Festival, or to, Melbourne, or, in more recent years, I used to take them to Europe to see Venice Biennale, Documenta, Munster, those sorts of things. So, it is a tradition that we as lecturers try to expand students' views, and they were certainly expanded by coming to Mildura, but I think the good folk of Mildura were a little concerned about these radical students from art school in the 1970s coming through the region. We had our own educators, and to the left-hand side of the long table, we've captured a few of them. Anne McMaster, Chris Fraser, Neil Fettling, wonderful educators from the region. And of course, we've had students who have gone and flourished from the education that they got in Sunraysia. You don't have to go to Sydney College of the Arts or Victorian College of the Arts or Goldsmiths or, I still believe that some of the teaching and the experiences that students achieved here in Sunraysia was second to none. And I've seen a lot of art schools over the many years I've been working. So I think there's a lot to be very fond of in the left-hand side. So the influence often comes from the right-hand side through the teachers and developing affinities with the things about our local place. As I said, Tom left in 78 and the Mildura Arts Centre continued. Gwen Stainton certainly held pieces together until Michel Sonier came out from France. Michel, I couldn't shut him up. He's back in Melbourne in France, where he came from originally. He came from the land. He was trained. He did his national service. He was an artillery man in his national service. Went off and studied history and then museological studies. Worked for festivals in France and then got the gig to come to Australia to be the director of the Mildura Arts Centre. He had the 1982 triennial that he put together, which was very much about building up capabilities, repairing a few broken bridges, so to speak, to put that exhibition together, which, the 8th Triennale really did present a more staid view than the 1978 one of Tom McCulloch. But I think Michel's great strength was his curatorial presence, his understanding of museological traditions. He quickly learnt about the collection. He was able to provide the provenance for the Degas, which the Louvre didn't have. He was able to find the Benzonis, 2 of them which were missing, and bring those back into the collection and start to curate exhibitions through a very formalistic approach. He eventually moved on to the Queensland Art Gallery in 1984, and Michael Murray came. Michael came from a different background. Michael had been a commercial dealer in the arts in Sydney and Melbourne, and had recently done a museological course through Rusden, yes, where he'd met Tom McCulloch and had heard the great things about Mildura. Michael, like Michelle, was from the land originally and had very strong sensibilities about responding to land. And the two triennials that he curated, the 85, which Michelle had done most of the work for, had a couple of new pieces that Michael Murray put into them, but the 87 one was probably the main show that he was most proud of, in that he was able to reactivate the area where Tom had created Sculpturescape. And some of you may remember the Temple of the Living Spirit by Lyndall Malani. Of course, I used to take all of my students from Redcliffs High School there to work with Lyndall to make little cans of rocks and to help her dig things and move things around. Jill Peck had a beautiful work down there in that exhibition as well. And really it became a true celebration of what Tom had started, but in a slightly more conservative approach. But the amount of effort, the time, the energy, the costs involved, the fear of controversy, and some of you might remember the Phillips work that was quite controversial back then, Kath Phillips, Butch and Femme. These things, I think, made it impossible for Michael to continue the triennials, and we moved into a hiatus. Michael was also quite interested in picking up the 2D, 3D interplay, and the Rickamore sculpture and print are a classic of his thinking about how we could be the sculpture place, but also to have work in the collection that was more manageable. He was very keen to work off the drawings of the artists and the actualisation. So the work by Kath Ellis, I think her name was, Kath Ellis, was obviously drawings and then installation. And some of the other ones I couldn't find the Alison Clouston drawing of the tank and the fish that was in the work, but these were really crucial works at the time. Michael's disappointment, he also engaged in other community activity too, like the World Sculpture Project, One Sun, One Earth. But his big plan was to reactivate the sculpture park, and he had done a lot of work in getting that together. This is the presentation to council and to funding bodies, but it was never achieved, and I think that was kind of one of the points that led him to depart. And next came, of course, Ian Hamilton. Ian had come from local government over in South Australia. Ian was an artist, very much a strong artist, and wanted to have that interplay. He, of course, had come to the triennials when he was in art school and really wanted to reactivate. The first show he did was Confluence, and I think it just blew our mind that he toned down the gallery, the lighting went low, things became theatrical. He brought in artists from all over the place to play. There wasn't that formality and seriousness. It was a very playful exposure over that particular period. And then through the poetry of his wife Jenny, who brought this word palimpsest, and to some it's become a word that conjures up all sorts of overlays, but I think certainly for an art teacher in the region, it became the starting blocks for something wonderful, something that reinvigorated the grand traditions of sculpture, but brought in science and art, brought in sustainability, brought in students. The early palimpsests were, of course, uncurated. They were opportunities for artists all over Australia to put up proposals and finding venues for them. One of the great palimpsests was, I think, Palimpsest 4, where we activated the Aurora packing shed out at Redcliffs, and artists were allowed to go wild in that particular space. And of course the Colette work that you see there was one of the sentinels in the piece, and I believe later in this year her work will be readorning some of the palms, the skirts. Some of you might remember those. I think there's a few left which will be brought out at a different time. I see John Walmsley holding court, and the work that we've been able to put on the back wall was from one of those palimpsests that he did. And of course it became a talk fest. You can see us all sitting around there talking about art, and I think Stefano, you might have been the chair at the time opening up the event. There were artists thinking about the space, they were thinking about the land, they were thinking about our future. This was a kind of a bringing together of minds. This was an activation of resilience about what sculpture can do and what the landscape and the environment are being subjected to at those particular times. Art and science, the work that Ross Lake produced, was it? And Helen Vivian was the curator. Artist 21 or something was good. Sunrise 21 was a wonderful, and that Rodney Spooner, which is out near Psyche Pumps, just, I get a chill every time I look at it. I think it's a photo that I took many years ago when the fog was rolling in. It's just stunning. It is just one of those stunning works. But also the workshops that we ran and the residencies, such as Harry Nankin, who was here last weekend, a beautiful show of his, and we've got one of his works in the show. And of course, Dee Hobbs, the piece in the banquet room with the feral bunnies in there. We couldn't miss reinstalling that for the show. But there were also lots of new sensibilities that came at that particular time. Arts Mildura became an avenue to explore things outside of the Mildura Arts Centre. The vault that Julie Chambers set up created an opportunity for printmakers across Australia and internationally to bring their expertise to Mildura, to run installations, to create work that inspired and was collected by people of the region. The activation of many of the degraded sites around during the Writers' Festival, we were talking about the Badlands, and you know, some of the salt pans do have a kind of aura about them that requires a rethink, and certainly Denise James's work from those, you know, many years ago activated those spaces. But there are also a lot of other quite haunting spaces within Mildura, and I know Dee got access to the Mildura Hospital before it was renovated and took some wonderful shots inside those. And when we saw Graham Drenell's work of the Mildura Hospital, it was just too good an opportunity to put the two together and see if people made the connections. The Indigenous voices, as I said, were crucial, and whilst we have incredible artists from outside the region, such as Julie Goff, and I think you'll all feel a kind of a warm inner glow when you see her slippers and roses with the little photographs embraced in those. It was a wonderful show. I remember up in the mezzanine many years ago, and so pleased that the work was acquired. But the homegrown Indigenous work, the Lorraine Connolly Northey, whose work adorns the most important galleries in Australia, Marie Clark, she is at her zenith at the moment. She's got work in the new railway stations in Melbourne. She's everywhere. And of course, the dance, the performance, and people like Peter Peterson, who continue to give and give and give as a local artist to make us understand the plight of Indigenous artists and people within this region is just second to none. The environment, of course, has been central to much of the work that has been looked at over the years, and Benita Eli's Murray River Punch, of course, comes as one of the great exemplars, and the two versions of it are in the installation on the screen. I mentioned the Yonatanis, the work Ross Lake talks about, I think it took something like 4 months to perfect how to bind salt without it dissolving, and so that you could actually cast the objects in it. And then after they had mastered it and found the right ingredients, they were able to produce this lavish banquet of objects out of salt. Penny Burns' work, the little Murray cod in the salt, is a work not in the show. There's another Penny Burns that we've got in there. And the stitched canoe made out of carps, if I remember right, Dee, wasn't it? I think Jill and you and Vicky Reynolds or someone did it. The mermaid one. Just trying to think, maybe Karen Sylvia or somebody. Prue Hobbs or... Anyway, it's not in the collection, but it was one of those pieces that was exhibited. Yeah, at La Trobe. Yeah, perhaps one of the Colin Barry. There's another important name when we think of Mildura. Narelle Howden. Yes, that's right, Narelle Howden's work. The John Walmsley piece, for those of you who might remember, he talked about being in the environment and bearing the paper so that it took on the earth and took on the living nature, and then of course drew back into it and anecdotal stories written throughout the piece. Denise's memories, the rubbings from tombstones and the paper petticoats, which was one of the palimpsest shows at the showgrounds of all places when it was exhibited. And of course the Reef Sawford's dance scene down in the basement, for those of you who get a chance to go down there, will feel the reactivation of memories coming through the works. Memories of flood, memories of all sorts of features are represented in the exhibition with Rob Claridge's work, and of course the flood from not that long ago, which devastated much of the Sunraysia. There are so many memories, so many great works, so many things for Mildura to be proud of. Just a couple of little shots. Stefano was saying before, we should be concentrating on local artists, people who come from this place. Look at that little suite of works. You go a long way to see 3 artists represented there. Belinda Fox has been working all over the world. Penny's, renowned. And Andrea's work is just so exquisite in those little installations. There are works just to contemplate, just to take a slice of. Ewan McLeod's work always reminds me of Mungo and that isolated figure wheeling the wheelbarrow. Judy Watson's small sentinel pieces, exceptional works within your collection. Ian Tully, director at Swan Hill, as printmaking teacher. Karen Wilger, who worked here at the Arts Centre. And Vicky Reynolds, also another printmaker of, national fame. You've just got so much to celebrate. You really do. And of course, the final piece in the show really is the work by Kate Cotching. It is actually owned by Ross and Helen, and they've loaned it to us. It's been reconfigured to sit at the end of the long table as a conversation. Its delicacy, its fragility, its acute observation of the foliage and the mallee is just one of those things that you need to sit and ponder over. It's an exceptional work, and we're so pleased to have it in the exhibition. So that's really to D or not to D. It's not about one thing or the other. It's about expanding our views. It's about taking us to our roots. But also, I think we have to think about what your centenary is going to look like. What will the collection develop? What will it hold? What will be important in 30 years? Will there be a new gallery that is able to accommodate more works? Will there be opportunities for residencies and development to take us to that? Will the sculpture park reach its kind of proposed thing, or will it always stay a slightly innovative, experimental kind of place that's not too formalised and has still got the rough edges that Tom was able to cultivate and Ian Hamilton was able to cultivate with Palimpsest? I think you've got a lot in front of you. I think you've got an awful lot behind you, but I do wish the good folk of Mildura and the Sunraysia every success in the next 70 years of your development of a collection.